IVM.
I think a sculpture or basically any work of art should make the viewer think. First thing that it has to do is visually capture the viewer. It is art. So I find that visually the aesthetics have to be a very high point. Whatever your underlying meaning is, your concept is, everything, of course, that flows together. But the first thing it needs to do is be so aesthetically dynamic that it catches the viewer at just like a flick of an eye. It just sees it and the viewer gets frozen. The second purpose is for it to have as many details or as many interesting points in it for the viewer to come closer and have a look at it in detail. And then it has to make the viewer think.
Hello and welcome to the Filter Coffee Podcast. My guest today calls himself an architect by profession and a sculptor by choice. His work is often referred to fondly as scraptures because he largely sources his raw material from the scrapyard. He is one of the most celebrated sculptors in Mumbai, and one can see his creations bring the city to life in many parts of it. From the imposing 15-foot-high Seat Rhino in Lokhandwala to the mesmerizing dolphins in Worli Naka, to his latest, the raging bull called Zebu in the business district of Worli. Arzan's work also adorns the interiors of some of the most prominent buildings in the city. I wanted to speak to him about a day in the life of a sculptor, what moves him, and most importantly, what motivated him as a 10th standard kid to pick up a welding machine and head to the scrapyard when the entire world was open to him. In today's episode, we are likely to speak about a lot of his creations. Given this is an audio medium, a lot of you might want to look at his work while he is talking about it. You could do that by visiting his website, arzankambatta.com, or going through a blog post I have written to be a companion piece for this episode on filtercoffee.com. That is coffee with a K. Welcome to the Filter Coffee Podcast, Arzan.
Thank you, Karthik. Thank you for having me aboard.
How has the lockdown been treating a creator like you?
I think it's wonderful. I think every creative person requires this break in their work schedule because that's the perfect time you get to experiment. You get to experiment with your thoughts, with your ideas, with new materials, with things you've never done before. So in your working pattern, sometimes it is very essential to put a break yourself and not essentially wait for something like this to happen so that everything stops and you experiment with it. But it's been good. I've done a lot of things which I thought I would never do. So it's been a good sort of experimentation phase for me.
Like what? What are the things you're doing which you thought you'd never do?
Like, for example, I used to keep on doing these black and white drawings myself in between my sculptures and all that whenever I used to get time. So then I realized, I said, why don't I sort of do Insta Live classes? And I started teaching people. So there first I started with 10 students, went on to 20, increased to 100, 200. And then I actually realized that a lot of people sitting idle who want to do creative stuff but are not able to and I don't know how to go around it in their homes. So I actually developed curriculums in black and white pen and inks, which I'm doing for the 6th time now in Jan and Feb. And they just filled up with people and we've had such phenomenal results, phenomenal interactions. I mean, they almost become my friends now, all the people who have joined in right from the first. So this is a new arena which has opened up for me. And I will keep continuing with it, irrespective of a lockdown or no lockdown. So that is one thing I hit upon, which was very, very pleasing and satisfying for me. Secondly, I have these things which I have in my mind, which I need to try and exploit and get out of my system. So one of them was, the craziest thing was, I had picked up a unicycle from New York in 2011. Just never got around to doing it. So in the lockdown, I said, no, it's no better time. I took my unicycle down in the basement, wore my gloves, my helmet, my mask, and I started practicing it, looking at some YouTube videos. And starting from only 2 pedals and falling down, next day 5 pedals and falling down, I can do about 1 kilometer now, so, wow. So stuff like that. So I just set these targets. Then I started juggling. I haven't got around to doing much of that. But things which you could never do. And of course, a little bit of baking as well. Of course, sort of very, very little, but a little bit of that as well. I would never do that in a normal work day, So it is things like this. You got this precious capsule of a time, sort of this time capsule that you got. And within that, I could do all this and experiment. And I still plan to do more,
Right. I'm glad I started with this question is because for an artist of your stature, I've always felt that you're extraordinarily humble, and there are these really childish things that always seem to excite you and inspire you. For those in the audience who don't know us, I think we met many times in one of the events where,
of course,
you actually take a lot of pleasure in teaching kids as well as adults to create. Right, I'll probably call it that. Right, it's through art and craft and multiple other things. Right, so it's always a pleasure to listen to you. Really getting excited about something small. Azan, I actually wanted to start this conversation pretty much when you yourself were a child, so to say. I think your first creation was, correct me if I'm wrong, but roughly, were you around 10 at that time?
No, the first creation in paper and cardboard and 3D works was when I was 10, yes. But then my first metal work was after I finished my 10th. So that was the first time I could actually go out to scrap yards, pick up scrap and sort of weld. So my first metal sculpture was just after I finished my 10th standard. That was 1982. So you're right there.
But explain that to me. When I was studying in my 10th, for me, spending time would be to pick up a cricket bat or to just get on a bike or roam around, etc.
Yeah.
How does this fascination for creating art with metal, especially with scrap, what were you doing with the welding machine at such a young age?
So, number one, to start with, I have to tell you, I'm terrible at sports. I'm terrible at sports. I have never played football, cricket, volleyball, anything. I don't watch sports. So there's a match going on. People around me say, "Hey, this one is batting and that one is batting." I'm completely oblivious to all this. I don't watch any sporting events as such. The only thing I used to do is cycle a lot. Okay, so that was one thing which just made me move from one place to the other. And what happened was I used to be very fascinated with machines. I still am very fascinated with machines, how they run, how one gear turns and turns the other, and in turn turns a bigger sort of a circle and something goes clack, 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 clack. There are these connecting rods and the pistons which move up and down, different motions which are caused by mechanics. I was very fascinated with. And I found that these pieces themselves had a lot of form and character of their own. So just out of fascination, I would go to scrapyards. It really sounds stupid. Like you said, a person would pick up a cricket bat and play. I would go to scrapyards actually and sort of pick up pieces from there, literally with my own hands, walk in the dirt, get cut here and there and all that, pick this up and then try to make stories from them. So just to give you an idea, there was this, there's a Fiat car and it had the Delco and the condenser. And there was one little Delco pin called the condenser pin inside that, I picked it up and it looked like a dog which was scratching the back of his ear, So the hinge of an ambassador looked like a tadpole which was peeping out of the water. So I would sort of do these visual associations with them singularly. Then I realized that I had the potential to join these pieces together and to make them more complex. And it was so fascinating for me. I would sit and weld about 5-6 hours a day, literally. It was a temporary, I think, madness which had taken over me. I can't imagine going back to that phase again in that sort of a craze, but I just would go to scrapyards, sit and weld and get things home. Again, go the next day, sit and weld and sort of get things back. Analyze them, go to other scrapyards, get more pieces, keep adding on, and that's how the journey started. And the results were very satisfying to me, so I just kept going on, just sort of kept pushing myself. That's it.
It's a fascinating story. But I'm assuming for someone of that age, you would have needed, if not an initiation, at least an inspiration in this direction, right? I think it would have been I'm sure a lot of creators, even in your class and in your circle, probably used to paint or draw, etc. But how does the fascination with metal start, and where did you learn how to weld and how to put these things together?
So basically, I am totally fascinated by things which are not done. I get clients sometimes which ask me, have you done this? Can you do this? And I say, I've not done this, hence I want to do it. So that's what fires me more. And I actually go to the studio every day, sort of thinking as to what will I do today that I've not done yesterday or before. And that is what actually sort of fascinates me. That's what pushes me till day to go with the same enthusiasm at the studio every day and discover and experiment and come up with stuff. So in my day and age, when I started, this is 82, 83 I'm talking about, there used to be a lot of painters, a lot of sculptors who used to sometimes work with clay and ceramics and all that. And I said I didn't want to do it. I just was very fascinated by metal. Since there were very few sculptors who had used metal as a vehicle of modern art, I said, let me do that. So I picked up scrap metal and started sort of trying to decipher what each form meant and connecting them into a story. And I started making my scrap sculptures, which I call Scraptures. And like I said, the point which kept me going was I found that no one else was doing what I was doing, which inspired me more to keep on pushing and sort of, so to speak, experiment more and more, go to more scrapyards, do bigger pieces, do pieces which moved around, and sometimes introduce an electric motor inside to see how they moved. And just like a mad scientist trying to get something done, I would keep on experimenting, and the results themselves would fire me up to do more stuff. That's the way it went from one step to the other.
Right. And at what point, Arzan, did you know for yourself that this is going to be your career, your vocation? This is where you will spend most amount of time.
Yeah. So I think I wanted to make it my career in the first week that I started sculpting. But, your parents don't take you seriously when you've just finished your 10th and in a week's time you say, I don't want to do anything but keep on welding and making sculptures. So what happened was, of course, my dad's an architect, still practices. And I would make these pieces and get them home. And his architect friends would come home and I would get a lot of inputs from them. I would get a lot of creative inputs from them that this is looking weak, you should do this and you should try this. One particular person suddenly looked at one of my pieces and he said, I want to buy this piece. This was in 83. And I said, I don't know anything about selling this piece. I said, I've got absolutely no idea. So he said, I'm offering you 2,000 rupees for this piece. So I went and asked my dad. I said, he wants to buy it for 2,000. What should I do? So dad said, of course, he's a good friend of ours. Of course, sell it to him. It's okay, So 2,000 rupees is what I sold my first piece at. And it was wonderful. 2,000 rupees at that time I was elated. And that's when I realized that this had a little value. Then another architect came in. Then slowly, a year later, when I already had started doing my architecture in college, just to give you an idea, my parents had nothing doing. You can't keep on welding day in and day out. You have to do some graduation. You have to have some degree. So I joined architecture. Okay. And while I was doing that, I got a call from architect Naushad Talati, which is like at that time, it was like God calling you. Okay. And Mr. Talati called me and he said, I want you to come and make a sculpture for me outside the Jewel of India restaurant in the Nehru Center, Worli. I was completely over the moon. I didn't even realize that what I was doing in my little way was getting around by word of mouth and people were sort of getting to know what I was doing. So that was my first commission sculpture which I did for him, which was my first outdoor sculpture as well, which was the seated Mughal outside the Jewel of India. And that's when I realized that this had potential, but I didn't carry on with it because it was getting me the money. I just carried on with it because it was absolutely my first love and I just wanted to pursue it. And then slowly, one after the other, as I had my first show in 93, 100 more people got to know about me and then more and more and more. And that's the way the word spread. It's like, an artist doesn't advertise, an artist doesn't sort of shout out as to show people what he does. People see the works and that's the way they come to you. So it just climbed on that way.
Right. When you try and read about a sculpture, a lot of people define it, as a frozen moment in time. And then there is, of course, activism, which comes in a big way, etc. But I've often found, and I've seen a lot of your work, which are beautifully captured, in your website. And I've seen some of your early works. They seem a little bit more playful. Even some of your later works seem a little bit more playful. How would you define sculpture? What does a sculpture mean to you?
I think a sculpture, or basically any work of art, should make the viewer think, number one. First of all, the first thing that it has to do is visually capture the viewer. it is art. So I find that visually the aesthetics have to be a very high point. Whatever your underlying meaning is, your concept is, everything, of course, that flows together. But the first thing it needs to do is be so aesthetically dynamic that it catches the viewer at just like a flick of an eye. You just sees it and the viewer gets frozen. The second purpose is for it to have as many details or as many interesting points in it for the viewer to come closer and have a look at it in detail. And then it has to make the viewer think. Okay, so it is a job of a work of art to make the viewer actually, in the end, think. Whether he likes it or not is immaterial. There are so many works of art which you put one work art in front of 10 people, they'll have 10 different opinions of it. Perfectly okay. It's all right. Art is meant to be that way. But they should react in some way or the other. So sometimes when a person looks at my work and doesn't react, I feel very lost. I don't mind if he says I don't like it, but I love hearing that response from him because it means that work has got him thinking and he has an opinion about it. So a work has to be aesthetically pleasing and has to sort of stir something in the viewer to make it a successful work of art or a successful sculpture as such.
And you mentioned your extraordinary journey from studying architecture and getting your first commissioned work and your 2,000 rupee tale as well.
Yeah.
But at this point, when you're starting off, who were you aspiring to be? What are the creations and the creators that you admired?
So number one, first of all, I saw the studio of a sculptor, which was, I think, a big deciding point for me to take up metal sculpture in the first place. There was a sculptor called Ali Davirwala, who was a Parsi gentleman. He had passed away long back, and I got interested in sculpture, and his wife knew that I was interested, and she gave me his studio keys. She actually took me there and said, have a look at his studio. Just sort of, get inspired.
How old were you at this point?
I was 16. I was 16. And I went into that space and there was it was really uncanny. It was like as if someone has left his work incomplete and wanted someone to start off from there. That's the kind of zone I was in. So I saw his incomplete sketches. I saw the chair in which he used to sit and do drawings on a blackboard, which was still there. The chalk markings were still there. There were wood shavings lying around. There were chisels on a table. There was a welding machine and the smell of metal and unfinished sculptures, which was just lying around. And I think it was a wonderful deciding moment for me. At the moment I saw that, I said, this is what I would love to do, And that just stuck in my head. And I've been aspiring to sort of reach where he is. He was one of the most prolific sculptors in terms of materials. He used to work in iron, in cast bronze, in stone, in plastic, in copper. Every material that you could think of, he would work in. And you can still see some of his works in L&T, Larsen & Toubro, and a lot of them in the TIFR, the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. So Mr. Baba was his biggest client and all that. And I think he was one person who sort of motivated me without having met him. His work and the space in which he worked is what motivated me without even sort of saying hello and hi to him, But then I got fairly close to his wife, his daughter. They helped me around. They gave me his books. They gave me his tools, which I still keep in my studio, which I value very much. And I think that's what pushed me. In terms of, if you ask me who inspires me as an artist overall, of course, Davirwala would come first. I will never forget him. Salvador Dali's works is what absolutely fascinates me, And just to see the kind of madness that he had and the kind of dual image works that he used to do. He used to be perfect at sketching skin tones. And he would be perfect at doing the surreal images where he would elongate the elephant legs and all that. So there was this combination of skill and madness which Dali had, which fascinated me a lot also.
Right. And is there a story to you working with a lot of scrap metal as your raw material? Do you find it exciting to visit a yard and finding a surprise there?
Oh, yeah. I mean, imagine this. Imagine a young boy going to a scrapyard, picking up pieces and looking at it and being fascinated. So I would get a lot of eyes. And they would wonder, why the hell is this fellow come here? Picking up one piece, selecting one piece at a time and putting it somewhere else. I would sort of dig my hands in that dirt and grime and remove the pieces. And it fascinated people a lot. I remember I was welding one day, and this fellow came up to me and literally looked at me with pity when I was working. And he said, "Saab, ye kyun kar raha aap? Why are you doing this?" And I found it very hard to explain to him that it's a madness, and I had to sort of do it to create this. But it surprises people. When you use scrap metal, it actually surprises people. But you get phenomenally good responses from after you do your sculptures. If there's a driver or a cleaner or a mechanic who sees your pieces and he's able to see what I've done, and then he recognizes the pieces from that. So this is from the Delco of my car, this is from the differential of my car. And they actually then they realize what I've done and how I've transformed and given a second life to those pieces in terms of creating a sculpture from there. So it's fascinating.
It is. In my mind, the image I'm painting is you walking into a scrapyard, and for you, it's like a kid walking into Hamleys.
Oh, yes. Oh, absolutely. Right. more madder, more crazier.
But, the corollary of that, right?
Yeah.
Does scrap metal and the scarcity and the surprise element of it, does it also impact your creative process? Is your creative process also sort of dependent on that element?
No, not at all. In fact, it charges it further. I'll tell you what. I'll explain to you. So when I started off by not having any idea as to what I would want to make, where you're correct. Then you see the pieces and then you design from them. So there is a limitation. But the amount of scrap that is lying around in this world and the kind of pieces that are there, you can do innumerable things from that. I mean, one lifetime is not enough to exploit the kind of scrap there is and do stuff from that. So in that way, I don't think it's limited in that way. But yes, to a person who has, not a very wide outlook to what he's looking at and looking at a particular piece, then it gets difficult because then you're trying to find that one piece to fill up a form or something like that. In the other aspect, what I do is then slowly I introduce new metal to my pieces. I started making things out of pipes and sheets and rods and straps and sort of cutting them and then sort of molding them into the way I want. So then at that phase, I was creating my own scrap. So I would combine it with the machine scrap and the scrap I got from my pieces, and that would give me a complete new kind of canvas to create new things. So yes, there is a limitation as well as there is not, because there's a lot of scrap in the world to sort of do wonders from,
Right. And, if I were to just go to some of your, I wouldn't say your biggest creations, but at least in the perception of the world, the ones that are most talked about, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the one in the Rhino in the Seat building often comes up, right, when people discuss your body of work. And then, of course, there is the dolphins piece, and I really want to ask you later on in the show about some repetitive elements in your work, like dolphins come very often, frogs come very often. I want to know about what your inspiration there is. Right?
Sure.
But what has been your most satisfying work till date? I know it's a very wrong thing to ask. It's like asking a mother who's your favorite child.
It is.
But do you have a few at least?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. So I'll talk of two pieces. One is a piece I had done in my 1996 show at the Jahangir Art Gallery. And like I said, I love doing things which are challenging. I love doing things which are difficult, because if you go the easy way, anyone can do that. So there's no fun in doing it. So what I did was, I love science and I love the way optical illusions work. So I created a piece which was a complete abstract piece about 9 feet tall. And if you see it, you'd see a vertical stick, an iron rod, and a lot of wood and metal flying around from it on all different sides. And the trick was that you had to look at it through a 45-degree mirror and a pinhole which I had provided. So when you look through that, there was the image of the Christ on the cross, the complete crucifix. And basically I did that as a challenge. I sort of closed one eye to destroy your depth of vision and got everything that was there in that stick. I actually designed it that way so that the image would come into the Christ with the nails and everything. And it was fascinating because people would see it, they would look inside from the people, again come out and see where the hell is the Christ. You can't see it. And that was very fascinating to me. So that was one of my first optical illusions, which I loved. And that's one of my favorite pieces so far. The other one is the INS Vikrant. So I was approached by ex-Commodore Bada and a Parsi gentleman who had flown the fighter planes from the decks of the Vikrant. And he got together with the other ex-Commodores and pilots, and they pooled in their own money and bought scrap from the Vikrant and gave it to me to make a memorial for the Vikrant. And It was so fascinating to hear the story because they were tremendously saddened. They actually felt they had been cheated because the government had promised that the INS Vikrant would turn into a museum. They were planning to dock it somewhere and change it into a museum. And they wanted the ship to be there. But then suddenly they just sold it off literally per kilo weight as scrap. Per kilo weight as scrap, it was sold to a scrap dealer who took it and cut it into pieces, completely destroyed the whole history and all the energy that was there in the ship, So it was fascinating to me to see that these fighter pilots who obviously were not very rich, came not from very rich families. They were soldiers. They came to me and they said, we've pooled in our own money. You come with us to the INS Vikrant where it's being cut. You select the scrap and then you make a memorial for us. So that's what I did for them. And it was wonderful. And you can literally feel the pain in them when they say that how the hell could something like this be destroyed? It was a part of our country's history, our country's legacy. And they were very happy that the memorial was made. So some part of the Vikrant lives on in those pieces, through those pieces out there on a traffic island in Bombay, in Colaba. So that was very fascinating for me.
That is a profound story, Arzan. I can imagine why this particular creation means so much to you. At this point, I want to remind the audience that if you want to look at Arzan's creations as he's talking about them, you could do so by going to his website, arzankambatta.com, or by reading a blog post I've written specifically as a companion piece for this episode, which you can find on filtercoffee.com. That's coffee with a K. Arzan, you spoke about your first creation, which is the Mughal, and now this beautiful story of Vikrant. I wanted to talk to you about your process. What are the different steps? What are the different things that go into something starting off as just an idea and ending as such a monumental structure which is there for perpetuity?
So I think this comes from experience. This comes from observation. And right now, the thing is, the moment someone takes me to a space and shows me a space and says, this is where we want a sculpture, whether it is a hotel or a corporate building or a residence, irrespective of the size of the sculpture. It could be a 2-foot sculpture to be kept in a residence on a bar top, or it could be a 15-footer sculpture to be done for a corporate outside on a traffic island. The process remains the same, where you understand where the client is coming from. To give you an idea, the sharpness and the materials I use to depict something of a sculpture in a corporate space will not be the same as if I'm doing it for a hotel. In the hotel, I have to go slightly warmer, I have to go cozier, I have to go a little more friendlier. In corporate, I can go sharper, I can use steel, I can use reflective surfaces which are slightly cold to denote what I want to do, to denote power and to denote reaching out to the sun, so to speak, because I've done that. And so in a hotel or a residence, you use wood, you use copper, you come down to slightly cooler materials, to slightly using textures which are smoother and more lyrical. So automatically now, when I see the space and I understand what the client is about, design almost pops up immediately. And then I take some time to sort of maneuver it and try to sort of gauge what the client is about and then sort of design it accordingly. I have done sculptures in corporate houses which tell the complete story of the company, starting from how they started and how that. So how do you do that without it being boring? So you have to know the client well enough to understand what he's about and sort of depict certain things artistically to sort of show the viewer when he walks into the lobby that this is what the company is about, against picking up a brochure and reading about the company. I'm just giving you an idea. So the Seat Rhino, what happened was the Rhino is the logo of Seat tires. And they wanted to sort of embellish that into a 3D work. because the logo is always just 2D. It always comes in a stamp on the letterheads or on the tires. So what the task which I had was not just to make a rhino. I had to make a rhino which was powerful, which was modern, which was contemporary and slightly abstracted. So I had to actually sort of sit and study the rhino. I remember I'm talking of a time when there was no internet. Okay, literally.
Of course.
Even if it was there, we had no access to it. And we used to go to library to study stuff and all that. I went to the museum. I remember I went to the museum in Bombay and I remember seeing a stuffed rhino there. And I sat there and I sketched out from multiple angles and all that. And that rhino is just standing as if he's just posing for a photograph. I wanted a rhino that was charging. So I actually started altering my pencil strokes to sort of denote that. And I wanted something, of course, that was moving ahead. It had to be powerful. It had to denote the force of the company. And so I sort of extended the horn a little longer than what it should be. I sort of gave the whole body a lot of these cuts and different textures to denote the toughness of the tire, so to speak. And also, I made him stand on only 2 legs because he was galloping forward with his head bent down and the horn pointing ahead, sort of giving an idea of speed. You understand? So all these little things have to be incorporated. And I think that's what made the sculpture so special. It was not just the rhino. The rhino denoted the essence of the company, the spirit of the company, and also the tire itself. Fast, completely rugged, and sort of moving in one direction. So that's what makes sculpture, I think, important. And if you do that, if you put that sort of effort into a piece, and if you're satisfied, 100% that the client and the viewers are going to be satisfied.
Right. Just to put this in perspective for the uninitiated, what is the size of this particular sculpture, the rhino? So
the rhino is 15 feet from the tip of the horn to the back and about 10 feet tall, approximately.
Right.
It was one of the biggest pieces I had done at that time in terms of bulk.
Yeah, and it is stunning, right?
Yes,
especially in its impact. The moment you enter the structure, the way it impacts. I had a couple of questions, which probably is coming from a fairly ignorant space, but I was very curious about it. You spoke about what it should be, what the sculpture should be, that it should be abstract, that it should be indicative of something, etc. But I come from an industry which is advertising, where very often the quality of our work depends on how good the brief is.
Correct. Yes.
In your case, do people really know what they want?
Very, very good question. Okay. So basically, I think it is a lot left on the artist to understand the client, irrespective of how much data he gives you. I'll go a little back on this. So you were talking of the Dolphin Island, correct? The Dolphin Island in Bombay. Now, normally a person shows me a space, a client, the architect, builder, whoever shows me a space and I design for it. Here, the client took me to the island, showed the island to me, and he said, I want dolphins here. Okay. He said, I want dolphins here. And
this is the one in near Worli Naka. Right?
Yes, in Worli Naka, yeah. So I didn't sort of fight it too much because I thought that dolphins is a good thing. It's near the sea. It's a playful sort of an element. People would see it. And he said, I want children to sort of actually ask their parents to drive by this island to see the dolphins, So I thought it was a very good thing. And I keep on thinking, why did I agree to it? I agreed to it because I thought it was a very good idea. He had an idea of dolphins. Probably if I had sat and sketched and etc., I could have come up with dolphins, but I could have come up with something else also. But here, I think the client had researched and it worked very well. So then it sort of completely cut down the design process for me, where I had to think in a complete open space as to what would go there that would look good for the city, that would be sort of dealing with the client's ethos and everything. But the dolphins fit in very well. So then all I had to do was sketch out, semi-abstract it, and again, then build it that way. Now, there are some times when a client has got absolutely no idea about what he wants. And I have done that. I've done a work like that for, if you know about Shankar Mahadevan. So I saw his space and he knew about me. And we had a couple of meetings and all that. He came to my studio. I'm talking of 15 years back. And he saw my space and he said, look, this is the space I want you to design for. It was a transition space between his living room and his dining room. It was a transition space. He said, I don't have any space. I like your work. See what you can do in my space. And it's very good. He said, I don't understand sculpture. Okay. But he's saying the same way as a person would approach me to write music, and he may not be knowing anything about music, I am giving you this task to give a sculpture to me, knowing whatever you know about me, and that's it. He was one client who didn't ask for a sketch. Normally, there's always a sketch before a commission work. Didn't ask for a sketch, didn't ask for any details, nothing, no costing, nothing. He said, just go and make it. So in 3 months, I put up a sculpture for him, which he loved so much, and it just sort of fit there. So it is okay if the client doesn't understand sculpture or doesn't understand art. The important thing is he has to tell me that he is that way. Instead of trying to understand and sort of blocking creative paths which happen from that, to completely sort of go back and say, this is the space. I don't know what I want. Just do what you come up with. So let's see what you come up with.
What did you create for Shankar and why?
So basically, I call it the soul of music, and it was a part human, part musical instrument by itself. So I always believe that when someone is playing a musical instrument, and the instrument and the man fuse, literally. I mean, you've seen them when you see them perform, when you see serious musicians perform. The instrument becomes literally a part of them. They sort of, literally flow over it.
An extension of their body, isn't it?
Yeah. Absolutely an extension of the body. So what I did was, I sort of did a complete keyboard which is flying out like wings. And that keyboard sort of comes out from the heart of the human, So very, very lyrical, very abstract, and just like a sort of how you capture a musical note in air, something like that, as light as that, So it worked out pretty well. I'll send you an image if you want to share it with your viewers. I'll do that.
That'll be lovely. We will add this in the show notes. But how long does a work take you? For example, the rhino, the CH rhino, or the dolphins in Worli. How long does a typical project take you?
So an average time for a project, if someone approaches me, my reply is 100 days. 100 days is what it takes for a sculpture of that size, an outdoor sculpture. If you approach me for a tabletop sculpture, which is, let's say, 2.5 feet or something like that, I would say about 40 days. So you get an idea of the timeline. And what I do is I don't only work on one piece at a time. I work on multiple pieces because I love sort of doing something creative, breaking away, taking a little break, going to another one, seeing what it looks like, and then coming back to it. I always tell my students that too. That don't work on something so crazily, continuously. I'm not saying don't apply the passion, but in terms of time, you need to break away from a creative piece, go away and come back and look at it with a little bit of set of new eyes to see what you've done and then sort of gauge and move forward. That helps,
Right. And, you obviously don't have a favorite creation, but you have had some really high profile, wonderful, very interesting clients, including the Big B, right?
Yes.
So can I ask you, do you have a favorite client? Who were the clients you enjoyed working with?
I'll tell you. So the Birla family is a very good client of mine. The entire Birla family, right from Mr. Kumar Mangalam to his wife, to his daughter, who also has a sculpture in her office now. Mr. Bachchan also. And Mr. Bachchan has become I wouldn't say an absolute friend, buddy like that, but very close. Sort of we exchange hello highs and a few notes here and there and all that. And
tell us about that story as well.
So basically, I'll tell you what. It's such a fascinating thing, I'm telling you. In 2003, I had a show at the Birla Art Gallery. Okay, I was invited by Kumar Mangalam Birla himself to have a show at his gallery when he had a gallery at Century Bazaar, and I have no control over the opening of the gallery, opening date of the show. That show opened on 11th October. Okay, he gave me the 11th October date. I said fine. I opened it. I realized 11th October was Mr. Bachchan's birthday. Then I had another show in another gallery somewhere. I got the opening as 11th October. I'm talking of 2002, 2003, and 2004. You booked Jahangir Art Gallery 5 years back. Okay, there's a 5-year waiting period. So I booked Jahangir Art Gallery. 2003 end, I got a call from Jahangir Art Gallery. 2004, your booking has come up. We are happy that we are giving you the gallery. Your opening date, 11th October. Can you imagine? 3 shows opening on 11th October. Okay, I was completely fascinated by it. I've never met him. Okay, I had never met him as such, except for one shooting episode which I had back in school when we were all taken from school to see a shooting, and we had interacted with him and all that. But I mean, you can't sort of say I know him because of that. So what happened was, I'll just tell you the story. MTV in 2004. MTV came up with this idea of doing a style icon show. They wanted to do a show on style icons. And I had just finished the 2002 show of these very serious pieces at the Birla Art Gallery. So what I did was, I said, style icon. I said, let me make Mr. Bachchan, So I made an abstract figure of him dancing in his favorite pose. And that was done. Okay, that was done for the MTV exhibition. It so happened that Mr. Pradeep Chandra, who is one of the photographers for Mr. Bachchan, very constant, he's a press photographer. He said, I'm doing an exhibition of my photographs at the JW Marriott, and I've just heard that you've done a sculpture for MTV. Can I exhibit that? So I said, it doesn't belong to me. You'll have to ask MTV. So because it was out of my hands then. So he asked MTV. They gave him permission. So they put the sculpture there. Mr. Bachchan came to inaugurate the show. I was there myself. He was hounded by cameramen, as he always is. He was almost plastered towards the wall where about 60 of his images were there, and Pradeep was taking it around, showing him the stuff. My sculpture was lying in the center of the room on a pedestal. Went completely unnoticed till he did the round, because there was no way for him to leave the wall and come to the center. Then he went on the stage, on the dais, where he was, of course, thanking Pradeep Chandra and thanking the other artists who had done his paintings and all that. And while the crowd was there, I was there. And I was like kicking myself. I said, why the hell didn't he see my piece? My piece was in the center. I wish he could have seen my piece. And what happened was, because of so many people, the sculpture on the pedestal started rocking. And because it was rocking, a waiter passing by noticed and decided that before it falls down, he'll pick it up and take it to safety. So he picked up the sculpture and he lifted it above the crowd. Now, when he lifted it above the crowd, Mr. Bachchan caught his eye, and he pointed out to the sculpture. He stopped talking and he said, get that piece to me. And that piece, he went and that fellow, of course, he couldn't solve this thing. They said, okay, fine, give him the piece. And I've got a photograph of him holding the piece and looking up to it. And then he said, who's the artist who's done this? And I was jumping in the crowd, sort of waving my hand. He called me on stage. He held my hand and he said, I want this piece. So I told him, I can't give it to you. It doesn't belong to me. It belongs to MTV. So he's saying, work out a way that I can get this piece. So I said, okay, fine. I'll definitely do something so that you can get that piece. And from that day on, he actually gave me his number to contact him and to get me that piece. That's how the relationship started. I went to him one day. I said, look, 3 of my shows have opened on your birthday without me having any control over it. My 2000 show it's opening on your birthday. I said, would it be possible for you to come and open it? So he said, yes. And that's how the sort of, it's very interesting sort of relationship which started. He came and he opened my show on his birthday in 2004.
Oh, wow.
So that's how the whole thing happened. So Mutual Admiration Society. He loves my works. Then, of course, he bought a few of my works and all that, which was excellent,
That's a fascinating story, in spite of me still reeling from the fact that I didn't know that the Jahangir Art Gallery had a 5-year waiting period.
Yes. 5-year waiting period. Yes.
Wow.
It's one of the only public galleries that we've got. So it is a gallery which doesn't charge commission. All you do is you're renting out a space and then you take it. But can you imagine, we need how many more spaces like this to exhibit art, to encourage people to come on. The rest of them are all private galleries which do it for commercial gains. Of course, the commercial gallery functions in a way that if you like someone's work, if they think that it will sell, they'll keep that the show and take a commission, of course, which is a general art commission of 33% all over the world today. So Jahangir Art Gallery is one of the few places which is a public gallery which only rents out the space. Rest of it is all yours.
What a place! What an institution!
Yes, absolutely.
Since we're talking about a prominent structure in Bombay as well, one of the things I wanted to ask you was, the landscape of Bombay itself has sort of changed in the last decade, right?
Correct.
I might probably be wrong because I visit Bombay, so it's probably changing. It's been changing for much longer than I'm saying it is. But what is your take? And see, for someone like me who, I come to Bombay at least 2-3 times in a month, and I spend most of my time on the road. And I've seen that evolution, right? Whether it is abstract or whether it is the statue of the common man or whether it is your work and many others. There seems to be certainly a more unchained sort of an expression coming through, right? But in your eyes, in your words, how do you describe the landscape of Bombay, the way it is changing?
I'll tell you what. I think it's changed, irrespective of the amount of concrete structures coming up. Of course, one thing is definite. I'm a cyclist. I love cycling, and I always say we need more green spaces. I go to New York, and that Central Park is such a boon to the people there. I mean, they can get lost within nature, sitting in a city itself. That is, I think, which is the thing that is missing in our city is that we need a lot more green spaces. Structures are coming up. You have the finest of architects designing our buildings now, right from Eo Ming Pei to SOM architects, and I'm talking of international architects, and the builders go to them to create these wonderful buildings which you see around here. And along with that also comes the art, so which is a good thing. So in the same way as they're approaching architects from abroad to do their architecture, the architect also educates them that art is a part of the new architecture and you have to incorporate certain art pieces within that. And I find that happening, and I find that that's very fascinating, not only for me as an artist, but for viewers as well. We need a lot more art out on the streets than what you see in the galleries, for the common people to see it and to appreciate it and to know what contemporary art is about, instead of just sticking to the initial folk art which they've studied in school or done that little bit of copy drawing in school and all that. To know what is happening around the world, you need contemporary art around the place. And slowly, if you see Bombay, the pieces are emerging on some traffic islands and all that. They're emerging. Not only mine, the other artists also, some very good ones who are putting their works out. There are some good sponsors there who want to exhibit good work. And I would say it's moving in the right direction. But the only thing which is missing, I feel, is our green spaces. We need a lot more green spaces, and then we could fill that up with more art, But that is something which is missing. But I would say it's going in a positive way. So not so bad.
You spoke about cycling in Bombay and
yes.
in New York. What are some of the urban experiences globally? And you're a very well-traveled person as well. What are some of the global urban experiences that you enjoy, mostly from an art perspective?
I think, number one, the amount of art that you can see out in public spaces. That is what hits you. In every corner. Let's talk of a place like Mexico City. It's got some of the most amazing contemporary art. It can defeat Paris in terms of the amount of contemporary art it displays on the streets.
Wow.
A place like Mexico City. And why is that? Because apparently culturally they're very rich and they love art and they love seeing art, and the authorities are very responsible, that they don't want art only in the galleries. They don't want art only to be elitist. So they put art out in public places to be appreciated or to be hated by the public. Like I said, it doesn't matter whether you like it or hate it. The fact is that you need to see more contemporary art out in the open to be able to sort of appreciate it. Another thing is, I keep saying, art acts like oases. In a city like New York, where you have this grid-like formation in plan or in elevation, everywhere you see these tall structures and you walk from one straight line to the other, there are no curves, nothing. Suddenly you find this rare sculpture of Alexander Calder, which is like curves and stuff like that. Your mind takes a break even without you knowing it. Your mind actually sort of takes a respite by looking at it even without you knowing it. So that is a beautiful thing. It's something which music does to you. When you put your headphones on, it takes you away slightly from what you're seeing and what you're experiencing. Art does that too. And you need more of that out in the public spaces to gently get the calmness into the lives of people. Literally, art does that. And if you have more of these spots where people can see, people can sort of talk about it, think about it, sit around it, it sort of helps the urban landscape. It helps the psyche of the people also, I would feel.
Right. No, I completely agree with you. In fact, I was just reading a piece which spoke about why we have water fountains in public parks. It is mostly to mute out, the kind of noise levels you associate with urban setup.
True.
So that you can sort of switch off from that.
Correct.
Right?
Arzan,
you're one of the most sought after creators in the country, and you held innumerable number of shows. I'm sure you have received many, many accolades from many different kinds of people. Is there an appreciation that has stayed with you, something that is really personal for you?
If you see an artist after a whole day of work, or if you see a corporate person after a whole day of work, the faces will look different. The artist obviously has enjoyed himself, and the corporate person not so. So basically what happens is people tend to feel, and it's across the board. People tend to feel that artists don't work. It literally has happened to me, and they say, like life is very easy for you. You always look as if you're joking, as if you're doing this and all that. And you tend to be seen more out taking walks or having coffee in the garden or things like that. I've actually sort of got comments like that. Right. And then it becomes like a norm that you don't work so much. Okay. Now, as a rule, I finish work at 5 p.m. in the evening every day. And then I'm doing my own stuff. Okay. I don't work more than 5 p.m. And that I've been doing right since the beginning, not right now. It's just as a norm. I like my own free time. When I'm walking, I'm thinking, I'm playing my music and walking around, or I'm cycling, I'm doing my yoga, etc. So there's this underlying thing that artists don't work. Okay. And at one point of time, it got very dicey because everyone used to think I don't work. And I got irritated with the fact. And what happened was then I had this lot of schools coming up to the studio to show their kids a demonstration of the sculpture of an artist studio and how the work goes on and all that. And I get kids from very fancy schools, and I get kids from the slums also. And there was this one group which was got by Teach for India, which was like the entire back road. There was this group of chawls, and all the children from there, they were being given free education by the Teach for India Society, NGO. So they came to my studio, and I'm showing them. And it is phenomenal. I have seen that the children from the lower stratas are more interested, more enthusiastic, have more intelligent questions to ask than any of the other students from any of the fancy schools. As a complete, I'm telling you, rest assuredly, this is the fact. Okay. So when I was showing them, I still remember this little girl came up to me and she said, "Bhaiya, aap kitna kaam karte ho?" He said, "How much do you work?" I said, "How hard do you work?" And I was elated. I said, at least there's one person over here who thinks I work so much from by seeing what I was doing out there, So it was wonderful. It actually stuck in my mind. I said, at least the little girl knows how much I work. Whatever other people think,
Right. It's an unstereotyped, unblemished sort of a view, right?
Correct.
So she's able to see
completely
what it would take, isn't it?
True.
Beautiful. Great. Arzan, we usually end the episode by asking our guest, what he or she is watching, reading, listening to. Especially I would love to hear what a creator like you loves watching and reading and listening to.
Okay. So, I'm very bad. Okay. Reading, I'm very bad. I'll excuse myself from that. I'm reading, in fact, a book called Bombay, Multiple Cities. But I read in snippets, so I don't read too much. Okay. It's a book by Meher Marfatia, and she writes on Bombay city a lot. She's born and brought up in the city, and she's got some phenomenal insights into old areas of Bombay. She goes into the absolute, researches by talking to people rather than reading history. You understand? So a tailor who's sitting under the staircase of a building, he's a third generation tailor, he'll be able to tell you more about the city and that area and how it has developed than if you study a book in a history library or something like that, So this is what she does. She talks to people and she writes these fascinating things about the city, and I love that. So it's about Mumbai city, and I'm reading that at the moment. In terms of watching, I saw a documentary on Netflix called Life on Our Planet, and I keep telling that to people. It is something that every school, every educational institute should show their students, and every person on earth should see that documentary to see how we've messed up this planet and how things are still not lost and we can still get it back the way we want to. It's beautifully narrated. I mean, absolutely a phenomenal documentary. And then taking a clue from that, I went on to see something called The Hunt. I'm very fascinated by wildlife. And I just the photography and how the things move within it and all that. And Then on Netflix, I also saw a comedy called Morte de Kai, which is of this story of this art collector, the crooked art collector, and wonderfully done. Johnny Depp plays the role. So I see a mixed sort of a gamut of things all together,
Beautiful. Azan, thank you so much. It's been a very inspiring conversation. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you.
If you like this podcast, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can listen to us on the IVM Podcast app or ivmpodcasts.com. You can also follow us on our social media. We are at IVM Podcasts on Twitter and Instagram. And if you want to reach out to me, I am _Karthik. That's Karthik with an H on Twitter. And filter_coffee. That's coffee with a K on Instagram.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. So everybody, please do help us out with our survey if you haven't filled it out yet. It's on ivmpodcast.com/survey. This survey is really helpful for us. And, fill out the survey completely and we'll put you into a lucky draw and we will send you some IVM swag. And what a great week of episodes we had and what an eventful week we had. Let me run through some of the episode highlights really quickly. On Paisa Vaisa, Samir Nair of Applause Entertainment was on to discuss the web series Scam 1992. Great conversation with Anupam was had. Do check that out. Bhavish Sumaya of Hasbro was on Advertising is Dead. On Positively Unlimited, Chitna is starting a new series from A to Z. This week, Align. Do check that out. And on GBCD, Farhad and Sunitra asked the question, what if they were straight? Interesting conversation. Definitely do check that out. I think you'll enjoy that. And one piece of news for you guys. Cyrus Says is now live on YouTube every weekday at 10 a.m. If you go to our IVM Podcast YouTube channel, you'll be able to catch us over there. And stay tuned for a lot more video content coming out in the next couple of weeks. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Namaskar, dear friends. My name is Ashish Vidyarthi. Life, as you know, is a journey. And you and I, travelers, how can we celebrate this travel? I have a podcast for you, Begin the Journey. I share stories and moments from my life. Do tune in every Monday and Thursday to listen to my podcast on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get your podcast from. Cheers.